makes a lot of noise. Okay, so we're in Kimei Tzeitcha. We're talking about leaving Egypt, leaving Mitzrayim, and what we've got, catching up to this point, what we've said is that there's the leaving Egypt. There's the historical event of leaving Egypt that occurred. This Pesach is going to be 3,328 years, right? 29 years, 3329. That'll be this year. And then there's the leaving Egypt that we do every day. The leaving Egypt that we do every day, just like the first Egypt, there was persecution. The Jewish people were subservient to Pharaoh. They had to serve Pari. They weren't free to serve God. That's what Moshe says to when he comes to Pharaoh. He says, let them go so they can serve God. Send them so they can serve God. Because in Egypt they were not free to serve God. So the same idea is with us. We have to leave Egypt every single day. It's not just in every generation, but every day we leave Egypt. And the leaving Egypt means freeing ourselves from those things that inhibit us or prevent us from serving Hashem, from serving God. That's the leaving Egypt. And that's what we're called on to do every single day, why we have to remember the Exodus of Egypt every day. It's not just commemorating a past historical event, but it's actually leaving our own personal Egypt, which is the constraints that are put on us by our animal soul, by the body, by the pressures of the outside world, leaving all that behind to be able to serve God. Then we said that there's another form of leaving Egypt. There's a higher leaving of Egypt, and that's the freeing ourselves of even spiritual limitations, of spiritual boxes, getting out of spiritual boxes and hard limits and definitions. And that's where we're at now, is discussing that this higher form of leaving Egypt, not just the Egypt that exile can't prevent us from serving God, that only our bodies are in exile but not our souls, and therefore we are essentially free and there's nothing that could stop us from actually serving God. But beyond that, there's also leaving that spiritual complacency or that spiritual box, the spiritual Egypt. And specifically the leaving the spiritual Egypt is what prepares us for the time of the redemption. How did we get to that point? So he explained, to get a little technical, just to get it's just half a box. To get technical, and just to be a little confusing, we quoted two verses. The verse of our Maimer, that our Maimer opens with, which is Kimei Tzeitcha meretz Mitzrayim areinu neflois, like the days, as in the days when you left Egypt, I will show you wonders. And the other verse, which recalls the Exodus, the obligation to remember the Exodus every day, which is remember the day you left Egypt. So in the verse, remember the day you left Egypt, the day is the singular, because there was one day that we left Egypt, and that's what we have to do every day. We're charged with leaving that personal exile. But then there's the days, as in the days in which you left Egypt, their days are plural. Why are they plural? Because there are 2 days, because there's 2 leaving Egypts. There's the leaving Egypt, as we talked about before, the leaving the personal exile, those things that inhibit us, that prevent us from serving God. That's one leaving Egypt, but it's days in the plural because there's a higher Exodus of Egypt, that is the leaving of the spiritual limitations, the spiritual constraints. And since this verse, the verse of our Maimer here, is referring to the redemption, the future redemption, that's why it says, Kimetza, like as in the days you left Egypt, I will show you wonders in the future. So since we're talking about the future redemption, therefore it uses the plural, because in order to get to the redemption, it's not enough to leave the Egypt as was in history, the leaving the physical Egypt, but it's also necessary to leave the spiritual Egypt. Why? Because the redemption is going to be a higher redemption, a greater redemption than the redemption from Egypt. That's why it's the future redemption, the ultimate redemption. And so in order, just as to leave Egypt, we had to go out of the physical Egypt. That was one form of liberation, one form of freedom. Going to the next level, to the future redemption, we have to leave an even higher, there has to be an even higher form of Exodus of Egypt, of leaving Egypt. Okay, so that's where we're at now, chapter 3. So what emerged, though, is that leaving, the second form of leaving Egypt, the Kimei, plural, the leaving, not just the leaving of the limitations, that not just the process of freeing ourselves from the animal soul, from the body, from the pressures of the outside world, but leaving the spiritual Egypt, that's a higher form of leaving Egypt. It's a greater form of leaving Egypt. Why? Because that's the one that leads to the future redemption. So what emerges then is that today we're leaving Egypt in a greater measure, in a higher way than we did even back then, when we left Egypt back then all those years ago with all the great miracles. So let's see, chapter 3. V'hinei mehanal, from what we've said above, which is what? That the leaving Egypt that we do every single day is a higher form of exodus than the initial one, than the original one. So move on. So what it's understood, Shabizman Hagalos, that in the time of exile, Hayitzia Mitzarim, the leaving of the constraints and the limitations and the boundaries, Mitzarim Nailim Yoser, is from higher constraints, it's even greater than the one during the time of the temple. So you would think that in the time of the temple times represented a time of spiritual prosperity, a time of heightened service of God. That's what we had when we had the temple. So we were more sensitive to God. We saw miracles. We served God, in a sense, in a higher level during temple times. Now in exile, where there's a concealment, we'll talk a little bit more about that soon, where we don't see God, so our service of God, in a sense, is on a lower level. We don't have all these great miracles. We don't have that access that we had before. So are we? It seemed not to be. It seemed fine. So we could say that we're better because we have greater challenges than they had, which is debatable, and maybe so, but that's fine. But the question is the form of service a higher form of service? Or was it a higher form of service then? So what he's saying here is that actually now in exile it's an actual higher form. Also, just merely from the fact that we are now we're living in a post-temple era, and since we're in a post-temple era, if we look at history from the beginning up till today, as a process, a ladder climbing, reaching closer to the goal, reaching closer to the destination, so we're going up, not down. So even though we're in exile now, nevertheless, our service, our leaving Egypt, in a sense, has to be greater today than it was even in the time of the temple.
It's harder. When you see Moshe the other day, it's easier. Never the good captors. It's easy. Boom. He's called out. Get that. Now we let me do another good capture.
Right, but here he's saying it's not just that the challenges are greater and therefore our service is a deeper one, but he's saying that even the form of shedding of our limitations is a higher form of that. Even though you would think people that were more sensitive, more spiritual, so their exile, their spiritual Mitzrayim would have been a higher one. We're saying no, our spiritual Mitzrayim in a sense is even higher. And within exile itself, in the generations that are at the footsteps, at the heels of Mashiach, right at the threshold before we enter the redemption, and specifically in the last generation. So we have an even greater form of leaving Egypt than before. In addition to the fact that every single day we're purifying, we're elevating more and more sparks, so we're simply accumulating more good. And through this we actually get closer to Mashiach. So the fact that we're getting closer to the end as a result of our collective service throughout history that's accumulative, and that's been accumulating, so that we're reaching closer. So in that sense it's higher. But even the actual experience of leaving Egypt, which is leaving our limitations and boundaries, every single day, is even greater. Furthermore, but since we're getting closer, so therefore it's higher. We're going, every day we get higher and higher. We're always increasing in holiness. So our challenges, or our leaving Egypt, is a higher form of leaving Egypt. But it's not just that. It's not only that it's a higher form of leaving Egypt, but also we're also leaving higher limitations. We're also shedding higher limitations, and through that is Yisku B'Karav Mamish L'Gula Asida. Through that will merit the future redemption, which then we will have left all limitations and boundaries. Okay, we'll get there in a minute. Let's take a look at note 19. We said that now our service is in a higher form, is a higher service. We're leaving higher things, leaving higher limitations, and it's what's leading us, since we're getting closer to Mashiach, to the time of redemption, so therefore it demands more of us in that sense. So we're getting closer. So we've accumulated a lot more good, So since the world is a lot more good, therefore that raises the challenge. So it's a better world, and therefore we have higher challenges to overcome, higher obstacles. Right? We're reaching higher peaks that we need to summit, and we need to reach beyond. But you would think to yourself, if you look at it from an outside perspective, just take a look at the world around us. Does it feel like the world's getting any holier? Does it feel like the world is any higher today? We referenced before the time of the temple. Is the world more sensitive today than godliness than it was in temple times, or less? So what does that mean? That we're getting closer, so the world is becoming holier, and therefore we need to reach beyond it. So let's take a look at note 19. So it says like this: yeah, with me at the bottom of the page. Note 19. Even though every day, just as we said, that we're making the argument that every day we have more positives in the world, there are more mitzvahs being done, so the world has more good in it, but by the same argument you could say every day there's more sin. Every day somebody commits a sin, so collectively there's more sin in the world today than ever before. So first of all, these things, unholiness, sin, is purged from our world, from our reality, through suffering, God forbid, or through repentance, specifically, especially when one repents through love. So in which case, it's not just that the sin is purged, but on the contrary, the higher form of tshuva, of repentance, is when one doesn't repent out of shame, but one repents out of love for God. So that love turns his sins then become merits, become positive things. Why? How does that work? Because why does it say that the Baal Tshuva could reach higher than a tzaddik? So one of the explanations in it is the idea that a tzaddik is never separate from God, and therefore his connection to God, his love for God, is a calmer love. A Baal Tshuva, somebody who returns, somebody who's strayed and now comes back, because he strayed, therefore his love is more intense. So there's more of an intensity to his service. So when somebody does tshuva, when he's returning to God, the fact that he has to return, meaning that there are things that he did, negative things that separated him, those negative things now serve to intensify his love. So it's the very sin itself that now becomes an intensifier of his love for God. So that's how the unholy now turns into fuel for the holy. So it becomes holy. So not only you can do tshuva to purge your sin from the record, to cleanse you'd be cleansed, and it's like it never happened. We can forget about it. It's either removed and it's forgotten about it, like it never happened. So first of all, we're saying that even though we're saying that every day we have more good deeds coming, we also have a collection of bad deeds. So he says, no, the bad deeds disappear. When a person either suffers or a person does tshuva, they disappear. Not only that, even the bad deeds that are there, it's possible that they can also turn into good deeds altogether and become even more good deeds. However, when we're talking about the Torah and mitzvahs, studying Torah and performing mitzvahs, that is added every single day. So him nitzchiyim, they are timeless, they're eternal. And so therefore they stay forever. You can never undo a good deed that you performed. You did a good deed that lasts forever. And there's no reason for it to ever be forgotten, or for it to ever be cleansed, or for it to ever turn into something other than a good deed. So all the good deeds that have been going on throughout history, every mitzvah, all the Torah that's been studied, and every mitzvah that's been performed throughout history is all presently impacting the world. Albeit it's concealed, but it still impacts the world. Whereas all of the sin that has been accumulating doesn't accumulate at all. That disappears. That's not eternal. That doesn't last forever. That goes. It gets washed away, or it itself turns into something positive, depending on how the sinner deals with it, whether he cleanses it or transforms it. Okay. So we see then that even though it would seem that the world today, while you can make the argument that there's so many great good things going on, but there's also so much bad. So he says, no, the bad is not everlasting. We can't look at the bad as accumulative, only the good. Okay. And so therefore, we are now standing sort of on that. It's one of the things Rebbe talked about with saying about, people say, Mashiach, you say that we're going to be the ones to bring Mashiach. How could it be? If you look back in history, we're not. There were much greater people. People were much greater. So the Rebbe would bring the example of the little person on top of a giant. Yeah, so somebody who's small can't see over the big wall, but neither can the giant. The wall just beyond the giant's view. That's right. You get onto giant's shoulders. So you get onto the shoulders of the giant, and then you could see through. So even though we might be small compared to previous generations, but we have the luxury of standing on the shoulders of the previous generations. Their presence is still here. The good that they did is still here, and we have the luxury of standing on their merits as well, and benefiting from that. And so therefore we're up on a higher level. Not that we are better necessarily, but that we have the accumulation of the positivity, all the positive things of history that we can use to our benefit. Okay. So to explain this further, to explain what we said that since we're reaching closer to Mashiach, and since that's when we're going to have to leave all limitations, all boundaries. So our form of exodus of Egypt today is a higher form of leaving those boundaries. Right? So we're saying that it's primarily through the generations, as we get closer to Mashiach, it is what we're doing in the last generations that's most impactful, that's going to lead us to the promised land. So to explain this, so Yuvan Bahakdim Abir will understand it by prefacing the explanation, So we'll understand it by explaining first this idea, what we just finished, the last paragraph, by saying that when Mashiach comes, we're going to be freed of all boundaries, even the highest of boundaries. What does this mean? So Ve'inyan hu came before about Maimer, as the previous Rebbe explains in his Maimer from 1948, that this Maimer, which this Maimer is based on. In fact, actually, note 20, he says it's actually it's two Mamarim. Our Maimer is based on the second of two Mamarim that the previous Rebbe published in 1948. This is actually at the end, the last paragraph of the first Maimer, Kibechi Pazain, which is, but they're both one series, so therefore the Rebbe refers to it here as just that Maimer. The Kala Eilam is Gam Eilam is Achin Eilim Nikroim B'Shem Mitzrayim. All worlds, including the highest of spiritual worlds, are called Egypt. So, in other words, we're explaining now what it means that we're leaving higher limitations. So first, what does higher limitations mean? What does it mean, a higher Mitzrayim? We know of a physical Egypt. We know of physical persecution. We know of physical, material challenges to our service of God. What does it mean that there are spiritual limitations? So he says that all worlds, even the spiritual worlds, are all called Egypt. All limitations. Why? Since they are all characterized as a limit and a concealment. So when we say world, and we talk, for that matter, when we talk about any type of creation, creation is categorized as time and space. So for something to be created, it has parameters, it has boundaries, it has a definition. A definition is a limitation, limits it. And now we're going to say that so even the higher worlds, which are spiritual, so they don't take up physical space and they don't have physical boundaries as do the hard boundaries that we see in this world. Everything has its hard limitation, its specific finite space that it takes up. So spiritual worlds take up spiritual space, but either way, they have their own boundaries, their own parameters, their own borders. And in fact, this is what the word Olam, world, means. So even though we call our world, our world is the lowest of worlds, but even the highest world, even Atzilus, the highest of worlds, even that's called a world. The word world, say that 10 times fast, the word world implies borders and limitations, even when we're referring to spiritual worlds, which is why we call those spiritual spheres and spiritual realms worlds. Fahainu. The fact that we call these higher worlds with the name Mitzrayim is for two reasons. Number one, because they are limited. They're not infinite. They don't extend infinitely. And so therefore, since they're limited, that we call them Mitzrayim, which means Mitzrayim, as we said, Mitzrayim doesn't just mean Egypt, but the root of the word Mitzrayim also means Meitzer, means limit, boundaries. That's number one. And another reason why they're called world, number one is because there's a limit. They have a certain limit, a definition. And number two is because they are only the product of the concealment of the divine light. Ukiyudua, this is going to sound familiar to whoever was with us here for Basi Lagani. The concealment of the first symptom, of the first contraction, shall yadei nasa makim lamid Israelim, is through which it became possible for there to be worlds, for worlds to exist. We explained, remember when we were learning Basi Lagani, we explained that there are two, what tzimtzum means contraction. And so when God wants to create the world, he has to make space for the world. because God is infinite. So how could you have a world that feels its independence in the presence of something that is essentially and fills every space? You can't. So the first step to making the world, God has to have it tzimtzum. And we explained tzimtzum, we go higher and higher and more. Sorry, what? Istalka. So tzimtzum means contraction. But within tzimtzum, within contraction, there are two forms of tzimtzum. One tzimtzum means constriction, limitation. So that's where you narrow it. So you take light that's infinite and you narrow it, you make it finite. That's one form of tzimtzum. And in the next chapter, chapter 4, we're going to get to the kav, which is that form of tzimtzum, of a contraction of the light. But a contraction, we said contraction also means two things. That's why it's a good word, a good translation for tzimtzum. Because contraction could mean making smaller, a narrowing. But in addition, tzimtzum also means concealment. And the first tzimtzum, the first one, was not just a contraction of making the light smaller, narrowing it, but actually removing it. Or, in other terms, for God to create a world, He needed to first create a space for the world. So what does it mean that He creates a space? He conceals His presence from a certain, obviously a spiritual space, in which to create a world. That concealment, that hiding of God's presence, is the first tzimtzum, and that's a tzimtzum that is concealing, a total concealment of the light. It's after that concealment that now there's a space, there's sort of a canvas where He can paint His world. And in that space, now He has a different form of tzimtzum, which is He takes the infinite light, but shines it into that space in a finite way so that it could create finite reality, finite worlds. So when we say olam, world, which means creation, it implies two things. Number one, it implies limit, that form of tzimtzum, a limitation, something that has borders and boundaries, a definition. But in addition to that, olam also comes from the term helim, concealment. Because for there to be any form of olam, any form of world, there needs to be a concealment of the divine light. Yes, right. Which is why also the tzimtzum is it's a concealment for the purpose of revelation. You hide in order to reveal. So it's not a real, okay. So the first tzimtzum is a tzimtzum b'derech siluk, a removal, right? God's, so to speak. It's not a literal, because as we said, it's only a concealment for creation. It's not that He, God forbid, actually vacates a space. But shenis alama or lagami, the light is completely concealed, it goes invisible. Bedugmas Mitzrayim de l'umazeh, like Mitzrayim of unholiness, Mitzrayim kipshutai, the literal Egypt, which is a concealment. So you have in Mitzrayim, you had that we were slaves, and we had a job, and we had taskmasters, and we had an obligation, so we were limited, we didn't have freedom, we weren't free to do what we wanted, we had to do what our taskmasters wanted of us. That's one form of Mitzrayim, but then there's another form of Mitzrayim, which is, if you want to serve God, and you're living in hell, there's no greater concealment of godliness than that. We learn, it's nice to sit here on a beautiful Tuesday morning in Miami where the sun's shining, where nobody's bothering us, and learn about God and God's presence and how God's impactful in our life. That's great. That's wonderful. And it might sound very reasonable and logical. But when somebody's going through challenges and hardships, that's a concealment of God. Or living up in the Northeast, exactly. There's no greater concealment of godliness. You suddenly don't necessarily see or feel God's presence. So in addition to it being a limit, being a constriction, a challenge, it's also a concealment. It's these two types of Mitzrayim, right? There's the limiting, and then there's the concealing. And world, when we say world, when we apply the term world to anything, not just our physical world, but even the spiritual worlds, it implies these two things. World meaning it has its borders, it has its boundaries, its limits, and also that there's a concealment. And the Rebbe says we can add something else from what the Friedrich Rebbe says. This is something the Friedrich Rebbe adds in his Maimer, where he says that you can translate the word olam in three ways. The word world, olam, the word we use, can be translated, has three meanings. Because the world is, when we say olam, it has three components. Olam kipshutai. There's the world, the simple meaning of olam, of world, which is shemeir al makom uzman. The definition of world, what defines is time and space. That's the reality. That's the first thing that happened when God creates the world. Is there's this concept of time and space. So that's one meaning of olam, one component. time and makim. Yeah, well, it always appears as time and space. It's always time first. It's man and makim, yeah. V'olam Lashon Helim. And then there's olam. The word olam comes from the word helim, has the same root as the word helim, which is dinyane hester. Helim, concealment, which is a hiding. And note 26, what does it mean? Olam, that is in Yonai, Helim, the Yonai Hester. So the Rebbe says in note 26 that this is Kenu Aloshem Ba'Maimer Sham. This is the Rebbe's quoting from the previous Rebbe's discourse, where he says Olam is from the term Helim, concealment. But what kind of Helim? A Helim that is a Hester, a hiding. What does that mean? So he says, V'yashleimar, what does this mean? Obviously, why does he say Helim? Because Helim, the word Helim is related to the word Olam. It has the same three-letter root, Aleph, Ayin, Lamed, Mem. So, if we're going to say concealment, we want to use the term Helim. But why is that not enough? Why does he also add a Helim, which is a Hester? So he says, V'yashleimar, ki Helim, because Helim, this concealment, Efshali is Gam Helim Mitzad Atzmai. Something could also be concealed on its own. Mash'enkein Hester, whereas concealment, I might not be doing justice to the English terms that I'm using for it, but hester means something hides it, something obstructs it. That the idea of this concealment is that it obstructs something. In other words, something could be hidden, it's essentially hidden, but then there is intentionally hiding. So for instance, in your personality, let's say, your personalities could be hidden, right? Your own talents could be hidden within you, and you'd have to do something to reveal them. Either speak it or show it, or whatever. Do something to reveal it. So that's because it is naturally behelim, it's naturally hidden, and you have to reveal it. But then there's a time that not only is it not revealed, but you actually take steps to hide your identity, to put a mask over it, where you're doing something to add an additional layer to that concealment, where it's not just that it's something that's unknown to somebody else unless you reveal it, but you actually hide it. So the world is not only that it's a concealment of the light, it also obstructs the light. In other words, when we say a world, the idea that a world draws attention to itself means that it's intentionally obstructing God. It's intentionally obstructing its creator, what animates it, what gives it light. So for it to exist, its creator, its animating force needs to be hidden, as we explained before. It needs to create a space for it to exist. But then the world itself goes ahead and actually obstructs it. By drawing attention to itself, it's actually hiding it. So that's a deeper form of concealment, a harsher form of concealment. So there's Olam Lashon Helim, the Inyane Hester, and then there's a third component, which is Va'olam Lashon Elam, youth. Shepirushehu Nairus V'kayach, youth and strength. Okay, let's take a look at note 27, first note 25. When we say Helim, the Olam is Helim, so it says, note 25, that there was something that was concealed from the eyes of the community, or something that was hidden from the eyes of all living things. So we see that Olam is Helim, meaning concealment, where you don't see. But then note 27, Elam, what does that mean? What's Elam? So he says, Kimei ben mizeh Elam. In Shmuel it says, who is this young person? And the term used is Elam. So Elam, Helam, Olam, it's all the same. So we see that Olam, the word Olam has three components. It means limit, Zman and Makim, right? Definition, boundaries. It also means concealment, hiding, and not just concealment, but also obstruction. And then it also means youth and strength, force. So Mavayir, Akesha the Gimel Pirushim, and he explains the connection between these three components, or these three aspects of Olam, Sha'ahelim v'Hester the Olam, the concealment of world, which is Zmanu Makim, time and space, Hu b'Teik of Gadol. It's actually intense. There's an intense concealment. That's how all three come together. The Olam, time and space, is an intense concealment of godliness, of its source. Why does the previous Rebbe bring this in his mimer? What does this add to what we're talking about? So the Rebbe says, the fact that he doesn't just bring the simple, the more common definition of Olam, which is time and space. Or so here he says, Makim Uzman, space and time. But also that the other components, that it's also concealment and youth and force. Because the literal meaning of a translation of world, Makim Uzman, space and time, Inyan HaGabala, the idea of limits, of boundaries, it only explains how the worlds can be connected, can be similar to Mitzrayim in that they are limitations. But in order to explain also the concealment of the worlds, to the extent that it's also that other component of Mitzrayim, where it wasn't just enslavement, but also a concealment of God. So in order to explain that, he also brings these other components to explain that this concealment is also a very intense concealment. Okay, what time is it? 9:05. So let's learn note 28. So he says like this. This also explains something else. This explains why he brings this idea of when we said that that we're trying to compare our leaving Egypt today to the typical Egypt, the first one. And explain how there's also that component of the concealment. So why does he bring this term of elam, which is this definition of world is not something that's found commonly in Chassidus. So he brings it the fact that it's intense, that this concealment, that's the result of the creation, is intense. It explains how the world, the concealment of reality, of creation, is similar to the concealment of Egypt. Because in Egypt we know it was an intense servitude, it was intense exile. There was a certain intensity to it. And so therefore he brings the term elam, which is not commonly found in Chassidus, to explain the intensity of the concealment. That it's not just that it's a limit, and it's not just that it's a concealment, but it's an intense one. Similar to the intensity of that Mitzrayim. So anyway, what emerges from here is we have, we're starting to understand this idea that what it means that we have to leave higher limitations in order to reach the redemption. Because since the redemption is a breaking free of all limits, so even the highest form of limits, we're explaining that really Mitzrayim it operates on all these different levels. There's the literal Mitzrayim, there's the literal historical Egypt, then there's the literal Mitzrayim as it is in our lives, getting over all those things that inhibit us, that prevent us from serving God, and all those challenges. But then there's also the spiritual Egypt, which is really all of reality, is a form of Egypt that we have to shed, we have to break free from it, we have to sort of peel away the facade, pull back the curtain, the Helam Vehester, the curtain that obstructs God, and that operates on all levels, even the highest levels of spirituality. Even in those levels, it's a form of spirituality, it's an experience, means it has a definition, means it's a certain experience, then it's a Mitzrayim. It's a limit. It's a limit, and not only a limit, but also a concealment that obstructs the undefinable essence of God that creates and animates everything. And now, on Thursday, I guess, we're going to move on to chapter 4.